Ronald Reagan's immense popularity helped his Vice President George Bush win the 1988 presidential race over former Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis. As former CIA chief, UN ambassador, and ambassador to China, George Bush was well versed in foreign policy. During the campaign, he promised to continue the conservative revolution that Reagan had begun. But without Reagan's persuasiveness, he was forced to battle a Democratic Congress over most of his agenda. Bush also promised to cut the federal deficit without raising taxes.
Read my lips. No new taxes.
A pledge that would ultimately come back to haunt him. Just 6 months after he was elected, George Bush had to abandon his "no new taxes" pledge in an attempt to reduce the massive federal deficit. The tax increase helped slow down an economy already showing signs of weakness. Businesses tried to cut costs by using fewer people to accomplish the same amount of work. Downsizing became a catchphrase for corporate layoffs. Another of Bush's priorities was to create an agreement ensuring free trade in North America. He pushed for the North American Free Trade Act, or NAFTA, an agreement with Mexico and Canada that would gradually do away with tariffs and other trade barriers among the three countries. Many economists believed that increasing trade with Mexico and Canada would create jobs and lower tariff barriers to American goods, while critics feared that it would lead to a loss of U.S. jobs. At the same time, the economy began to shift from manufacturing products such as cars and appliances to producing high-tech computers, software, information, and services. Along with the emergence of the Internet, these trends would revolutionize American education and business. Nevertheless, the economy remained sluggish. So, in 1992, Bush offered an economic revival plan. But when Congress attached an amendment raising taxes on the wealthy, Bush vetoed the bill. President Bush's biggest success came overseas when a United Nations coalition led by the U.S. ended Iraqi President Saddam Hussein's illegal occupation of Kuwait in 1991. Kuwait, an oil-rich conservative Persian Gulf nation, had been attacked and occupied by Iraq in a dispute over oil rights. Seeing the invasion as a threat to the world's supply of oil, President Bush organized a large coalition of nations to oppose the invasion. When Saddam refused to leave Kuwait, the UN forces, including 500,000 U.S. military personnel, attacked Iraq. The Gulf War began with a month-long bombing campaign, followed by a 100-hour ground war that drove Iraqi troops out of Kuwait. George Bush was widely praised for his handling of the Persian Gulf War and his steady hand as the Soviet Union collapsed.
George Bush had won a major victory in terms of public relations in the Gulf War. On the other hand, the victory for his presidency that the Gulf War represented would not last.
Many Republicans felt betrayed by the president's reversal on his "no new taxes" pledge. And despite approval ratings of nearly 90% after the Gulf War, many Americans believed that Bush was out of touch with their everyday problems and blamed him for the poor state of the economy.
The economy would begin a kind of spiraling downturn in the late 1980s and would create the impression in the United States that Bush had been much more interested in foreign policy than what was going on at home.
The tendency of voters to judge a president based heavily on the state of the economy would limit the presidency of George Bush to one term. The rapid collapse of the Soviet Union and the sudden end of the Cold War left the U.S. and Western Europe scrambling to reshape a new world in which democracy and capitalism would flourish. But change did not reach everywhere. The liberalizing movement that had swept through Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was stopped cold in China. In 1989, student protesters staged a massive demonstration in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, demanding democracy. The government crushed the demonstration and killed many of the protesters.
The Chinese response was very much in line with the traditional response of the Chinese government to domestic political dissent. Don't tolerate it.
The way to do the president is to start out with Mr. Rogers. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Then you add a little John Wayne. Here we go. Let's go over the ridge. You put them together. You got George Herbert Walker Bush.
I, George Herbert Walker Bush.
In 1989, George Bush became the first sitting vice president to win a presidential election since Martin Van Buren in 1836. Bush helped secure his victory with a bold campaign pledge.
Read my lips. No new taxes. And we've got to hold that line.
What was important at that point in time was to sound decisive. It could have been read my lips, I will stand up to the Soviet Union, or read my lips, I will shop at Walmart. It really didn't matter. It was decisive.
Number 41, George Herbert Walker Bush, 1989 to 1993, 64 years old, from Texas. George Bush's resume was long and distinguished. He had been a two-term congressman from Texas, a UN ambassador, and was the first president to have been head of the CIA. Bush was a New Englander by birth, but spent much of his adult life in Texas. He was a Yale man known for loyalty to his friends and a competitive streak that carried over from sports into politics.
Oh, get in.
Bush's opponents seized upon his preppy image and characterized him as a wimp.
You know, the wimp factor really isn't fair, because this is a man who is a World War II hero, who got blown out of his airplane, almost died serving his country. George Bush is many things. A wimp is simply not one of them.
With his management style, Bush set out to show that he was more engaged than his predecessor, Ronald Reagan.
Bush drove everybody crazy trying to keep up with him in the White House.
He was basically a very nice guy and very much a centrist in a way. He really liked to govern the country, based on consensus.
Bush's presidency was defined by two major foreign policy events, the end of the Cold War and the Gulf War against Saddam Hussein. In both instances, he displayed his deftness for patient diplomacy. But as the free world cheered the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, President Bush was actually criticized for playing it cool.
You don't seem elated, and I'm wondering if you're thinking of the problem.
I'm just not an emotional kind of guy.
Well, how elated are you?
I'm very pleased.
There was one politician who said that if it was me in the White House, I'd be dancing on top of the Berlin Wall. I'm glad he wasn't. Bush instinctively knew that for bigger and better things, he was going to need Gorbachev's partnership.
The way to do that was not to stick it in their eye when the Berlin Wall came down, but to continue to work with them so the Cold War would end with a whimper and not with a bang, and that's what President Bush did.
The most difficult test of Bush's presidential leadership began in August of 1990, when Iraqi strongman Saddam Hussein invaded neighboring Kuwait.
Unfortunately, Iraq has thus far turned a deaf ear to the voices of peace and reason.
In his public speeches, Bush emphasized the need to respond to the naked aggression of Saddam Hussein, but he had other reasons for taking the country to war.
Look, I've been a member of 4 administrations. In every one of those administrations, we had as a written national security policy that we would go to war to protect the energy reserves of the Persian Gulf, if necessary, to protect access to those energy reserves for the West. Well, it was necessary in 1991, and we did it.
In the months leading up to the Gulf War, George Bush worked the phones, enlisting the support of the United Nations and building an international coalition of 34 countries to eject Saddam from Kuwait.
I think that the elder George Bush was the best foreign policy president we've had in my lifetime. He realized it would be wrong and counterproductive for America to try to do the invasion and be responsible for its aftermath without the support not only of our European allies, but of Arab nations in the region. And it was that type of foreign policy, that ability to be an internationalist and to care about other nations and allies, that really set the elder George Bush apart.
We are not here on some exercise. This is a real-world situation. And we're not walking away until our mission is done, until the invader is out of Kuwait.
After 5.5 weeks of aerial bombardment, the ground war began. Within hours, the Iraqi army was in full retreat from Kuwait, and soldiers were surrendering en masse. Bush now had an opportunity to send troops into Baghdad to topple Saddam's regime, but instead he declared it was mission accomplished. Leaving Saddam in power was a controversial decision, but one about which Bush had no doubts.
Taking Saddam out of power was never one of George Bush's stated war aims. The stated war aim was getting him out of Kuwait.
We tried to get him, of course, during the war, because he was the leader of the Iraqi armed forces. That would have been perfectly legitimate. To get him after the war, we would have had to occupy Iraq, go all the way to Baghdad, and we see today that was not a particularly attractive choice.
After the war, Bush's approval rating soared to 84%. Re-election in 1992 seemed likely. But the deficit spawned by the Reagan years had forced the president to renege on his famous campaign pledge and agree to raise taxes.
Bush betrayed our trust. He raised our taxes.
It may have cost him the election, but it was probably good for the country.
I think one of the great things George Bush did is to go back on that pledge and to make the compromises necessary with the Democratic leadership on Capitol Hill to get us a little bit closer to the path of a balanced budget. That worked, and that helped set the stage for the great economic growth of the 1990s.
Unseated by the charismatic Bill Clinton, President Bush left behind a legacy of political moderation. In the end, he proved to be an able, behind-the-scenes operator and skilled diplomat, but an inadequate salesman of his ideas and policies. In 1974, George Bush, as chairman of the Republican National Committee, formally asked Richard Nixon to resign.